Star Wars Age of the Republic Villains is this era's counterpart to Age of the Republic Heroes. It has 4 24-page one-shot comics, with each issue focusing on Darth Maul, Jango Fett, Count Dooku and General Grievous, and also includes one of the stories from the special. Darth Maul is the first story in the book and it's called Ashes, and I really liked it for 2 reasons. The first is that Jody Houser has directly referenced the previous Darth Maul comic, and we know for a fact that it takes place after that because Maul explicitly states that he's taken the name of the Jedi Padawan he slew in that comic. I love that, and we need more of that in Star Wars. If they flat out refuse to give us a timeline, then a direct reference like that makes all the difference, and I know exactly where it goes on the timeline. And that's not the only reference to it. Maul and Sidious both discuss how Maul killed the Padawan, and they do it on the same balcony they were standing on in the last comic. They even go back to Malachor, something that we saw them do when Maul was younger in the other trade. There's just so much that actually goes hand in hand with that comic that I think probably 80% of this is connected to it. It feels like it was spare stuff they couldn't fit into the Maul trade and had to cut. I actually said it when I reviewed the Maul comic that if Maul had been working alone and the bounty hunters weren't there, it would have created a more intimate story, and I can't help but feel like if they'd have done what I said, cut the bounty hunters and left all this in, then the Darth Maul trade would have been amazing. The second reason I love this comic is that Luke Ross has done the pencils, and he did the pencils on the Darth Maul comic I just mentioned, and in the new canon his interpretation of Maul is my favourite. Once again, Ross has done an excellent job injecting emotion into Maul's face, be it rage, impatience or hate, and I honestly think he's surpassed himself, and not only that, I think this may be the best Maul that's been drawn in a comic ever. I really enjoyed Ross's pencils in this, and kudos to him for doing such an incredible job. And speaking of an incredible job, Harvey Tartaglia deserves credit too. He didn't work on the last Maul comic, Nolan Woodard did the colouring there, but Tartaglia has clearly paid attention to how this one-shot connects with that comic, because not only does the colour palette match the Darth Maul comic that Ross worked on, but just like that comic and Woodard's colouring, Tartaglia has had the good sense not to just colour Maul's face in full red and black like so many artists do. And this allows Ross's pencils to shine through, and the combination of both not only give Maul the kind of expression he's always deserved in comics, but also works in tandem with the story to really make it feel like this is just a continuation of that comic rather than a one-shot. Seriously, I cannot express enough how pleased I am with the Darth Maul one-shot. The art matched the Darth Maul trade in spite of the fact that only one member of the team worked on both, and the story directly references that book. In fact, it relies on it so heavily that this comic doesn't really feel like it was a one-shot, and feels more like what you would get if they released a director's cut of the Darth Maul comic. Seriously, it fits in so well, and I love when teams go to that kind of effort because the attention to detail they show to match things up really shows how much they care, and as a fan, I appreciate it and it shines through on the pages. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say that for the people who think I rag on Pablo Hidalgo too much, everything I've said about this comic is the way he should be doing his job. He should be directly referencing other comics and drawing on them as influences, and should certainly be trying to connect things the way Houser has gone out of a way to connect these comics. I don't hate Pablo, I just want him to create lore and concentrate on world building like this, rather than focusing on the TV shows and letting the books and comics slip. I don't hate on Hidalgo because I dislike him as a person, I do it because I want to see a better Star Wars. His sister wife, on the other hand, is an antagonising person, and I don't like her on a personal level, but Pablo I dislike on a professional level. Seriously, well done to the entire creative team who worked on the Darth Maul one-shot. It was as perfect as a 24-page comic can get. The second story is about Jango and Boba Fett, and it's called Training, and it's okay for what it is. Again, you can't expect too much from a 24-page story, but I've just never been that into Jango, to be honest, and since George Lucas kind of messed around with Boba in the prequels and his constant failures in the Clone Wars cartoon, Boba just hasn't been that interesting to me as he was in the original trilogy and Legends. Despite that, I think Jody Houser did a good job showing Boba's training with Jango, and Jango's ties to Count Dooku. I can't recall anything in the new canon stating that the Feline can manipulate people with their incredibly strong pheromones the way they could in Legends. Obviously the most notable case for that is Prince Xizor in Shadows of the Empire. So when Django and Boba go on a relatively easy mission to return a love-struck girl to her father after she's run away with a Feline called Griff, it's hard to tell whether she was manipulated into leaving or left off her own accord. Either way, it's an easy mission with a small crew and an ideal opportunity to start training young Boba. I think the comic does a good job of showing the small steps Django took to train Boba, and it shows that it wasn't just in the art of combat, it was also about how to build his reputation, something that we all know will lead to Boba Fett being known as the most notorious and ruthless bounty hunter in the galaxy. During the mission, the Fetts are double-crossed by most of the team, and Boba ends up on the wrong end of a blaster. Rather than staying to protect his son, Django does nothing, giving Boba the chance to put into action the lessons Django's been teaching him. Boba kills the double-crossers, but questions whether to leave the last member alive, even though he didn't have any part in the betrayal. He lets him go, and the end of the comic reveals Boba let him go so that he could tell other people about what happens when you betray a Fett, and ultimately this was the main point of the comic and the lesson Django had been teaching Boba. It worked, it was a good story, and again it's a 24-page issue that does a good job of showing a decent bit of depth and character growth. There's also a few pages where we see Dooku talking to Django on one of the moons of Bogdan, but it doesn't really add anything new, rather it just shows us something that we already knew happened. And there's also a page where we see him walking around the Geonosis cloning facility, which is interesting because Django expresses how he feels no pride in the clones at all. To him, they're just raised to be mindless cannon fodder. Tools to die for the Republic that have barely anything in common with him. Even his DNA has been manipulated so it's not the same as his anymore, and I can totally understand his disassociation with the clones because of that. They may have his face, but they don't have his lessons, and that's the other point of the comic. Boba is the clone with all of Django's lessons. Boba is the real clone of Django. Boba is a real Fett, the rest are just meatbags born to die. The art is okay, and Luke Ross has done fine with the pencils, but I just can't get that excited about it because it didn't really have the kind of depth to it that the Maul story had. The art is perfectly good though, and while it's hard to draw the Fett mask wrong, Ross has done an excellent job with Boba's face in particular, showing that quick temper that we saw in Attack of the Clones. Half of Tartaglia's work has the same issues here, not to say there's anything wrong with his work, it's just hard to get excited about colours in a story where there isn't much action. There was a very small amount, but that combined with the fact that the story was mostly about teaching Boba a lesson, there weren't really any places where either Ross or Tartaglia could show off and really make you look at something. But that's okay. The fact that the comic is about teaching Boba a life lesson shows that both Ross and Tartaglia did their jobs properly. It wasn't about being a flashy action comic, it was about a lesson, so the comic mostly didn't need flashy art. So the Django story isn't my favourite by any means, but it's good for what it is, and at only 24 pages it's still worth a read, even if neither of the Fetts are your favourite Star Wars character. Count Dooku's story is called The Cost and sees him travel to Sullust, and it's interesting. It's the first time I've ever seen the surface of Sullust in a city, and I thought it was quite odd because there's lava flowing everywhere, there's statues pouring the stuff out into depressions that form patterns on the streets. As visually striking as it is, I just can't see any city allowing something that dangerous to be in a public space like that. Sure, Sullust isn't exactly the kind of place you'd want to raise your kids, it's a factory planet, but still, in the beginning, the Sullustan Dooku meets with talks about tourism, and having streets filled with flowing lava doesn't exactly scream tourist attraction to me. Jack Zinn, a Jedi Knight, sees Dooku and mentions the death of Qui-Gon, and since Dooku isn't known as the leader of the Separatists yet, it must take place sometime between the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. He also mentions that as a youngling he saw Dooku and Yoda in one of their demonstrations of lightsaber combat, and we get to see Dooku's lightsaber as a Jedi was still curved, but now we know it was blue, which was a nice little thing to include. Jack Zinn later reveals that he was dispatched by the Council to investigate the Caldana Syndicate, a group we last heard of in the Most Wanted novel, and through Dooku's inner monologue we discover it's the group Darth Sidious had sent him to recruit to their cause. Dooku convinces him to let him help the Jedi, and they go and investigate the Caldana Syndicate's hideout, and caught in an ambush, Dooku reveals his red lightsaber. Up till that point, I was wondering how long it would take before his lightsaber made an appearance, because as we all know, only the Sith use red blades, and it would have been a dead giveaway to the Jedi and force a confrontation between them. Fortunately, Jody Hauser hasn't missed a beat, and the moment Dooku ignites his lightsaber, Jaxin shows visible shock at the colour and questions who built it. After announcing that he did, of course, Dooku quickly kills him with a blaster in his back, which I appreciated because rather than defeating him in an out-and-out lightsaber fight, a blaster in the back using the Force is more deceptive and fits in perfectly with the way I would imagine Dooku to act. Dooku then finishes his dealings with the Sullustan and leaves the planet without leaving a trace of his handiwork or plans for the galaxy behind. I thought it was a good story, and just like the others, it was short and to the point. Jody Hauser once again did a good job showing how deceptive Dooku can be, and she's done a good job showing how Dooku and Sidious set out to control the galaxy, even going so far as to control the smaller gangs. I'm not really sure why Hauser used the Caldana Syndicate though, other than the fact that they'd been in Most Wanted, and it doesn't make sense to me since in Most Wanted it stated that they only have control in their system. Given the fact that Corellia is a core world and Sullust is in the Outer Rim, and the fact that this story is set at least a decade earlier than Most Wanted, I don't think it should have been the Caldana Syndicate. It could have been a new gang or Black Sun, anyone but the Caldana Syndicate. That said, maybe they were expanding and eventually failed, because there is a hyperspace route between Corellia and Sullust, so it's not unthinkable. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where it doesn't make sense, but if you fill in the gaps, it can make sense, but I don't really want that. Luke Ross once again did a great job with the pencils, and I really love his style, showing some really great expression on Dooku's face on quite a few panels that really show off his deceptiveness and viciousness, and Harva Tartaglia once again did a good job with the colours, particularly the lightsabers, but also with the lava in the streets. The General Grievous story is called Burn. It shows Grievous on the planet Lediv hunting Jedi during the Clone Wars, and once he kills a master and an apprentice, he finds a map on one of the bodies to a forgotten temple. Grievous travels there and enters, and I really have no idea why Hauser wrote this in, but for some reason there are traps everywhere. This really didn't make sense to me because I just can't imagine the Jedi building their temples like that with the spikes on balls and chains everywhere, and it felt so out of place that it actually reminded me of the 2D Mario games and the early Resident Evil games. It just made no sense whatsoever, and it's never explained why the traps are there. At the centre of the temple, Grievous finds a waterfall with a light inside, and when he tries to retrieve the source of the light, he can't feel anything, so he jumps into the waterfall and falls victim to some form of Jedi mind trick, but not the usual kind, or the Force, or something. I don't know. Mentally, he's transported to a kind of null space where some unspecified voices try to break him down, forcing him to see himself as the organic being he once was, even going so far as to remove one of his arms and split his body apart into organs to show him how much damage he's done to himself. I thought it was interesting because Grievous doesn't look back on his choices and think he might have made a mistake and taken the wrong path. He sees himself as a weapon, something he chose to become in order to hunt down the Jedi. I thought it was also interesting to hear the disembodied voice say that he's carved away his own connection to a power that he doesn't understand. I found this particularly interesting because, as we discover in the New Jedi Order and Knights of the Old Republic 2, it's possible for the Force to just leave a being if they cause enough destruction or do enough damage to themselves. I know those two aren't canon anymore, but it was a nice nod to those two, and I appreciate Hauser including it, and shows she has a good understanding of the lore of both universes and doesn't just rely on the unimpressive Clone Wars cartoon show. Speaking of the Clone Wars, when I saw Grievous hunting the Jedi at the beginning of the book, it really reminded me of the original Clone Wars show, the micro cartoon that started before Revenge of the Sith was released and gave the world its first look at General Grievous and Asajj Ventress. Grievous escapes the threat of whatever has the voices and orders his flagship to fire all its cannons on the temple, destroying it. I'm getting bored of repeating myself, but I do think Jody Hauser once again did a great job, although this one felt a little lighter. I'd like to know who those voices belonged to. Did they belong to the Jedi? If so, were they the Jedi Grievous had just killed? Or did the voices belong to the Force? It's never made clear, and it's something I would like to know, so hopefully that's something she'll expand on at another point in time, but I do understand that it didn't really need to be explained here. This story was about Grievous and told from his point of view. If Hauser had explained exactly who the voices were, it wouldn't have made much sense in the narrative. And it also left me wanting more. I do want to know who they were, so that's good. Always leave them wanting more. Luke Ross's pencils were once again on point, and while I would have preferred a few more close-ups of Grievous's face using his eyes to show emotion, he did an awesome job drawing Grievous in several battle poses. There had to be at least 5 or 6 full body drawings of Grievous with his lightsabers out, and Ross has drawn him flawlessly, and perhaps more importantly, the poses he's been drawn in always look like the way Grievous would stand, fight or move from the movie, so Ross really did a fantastic job there. Harvard Tartaglia also did a fantastic job. Seeing all 4 of Grievous's lightsabers lit up with Tartaglia's colours is really fantastic, and his use of shading on Grievous's face really does look spot on, although I did notice that Grievous is a bit more white in this, whereas he's a bit more of a yellowy beigey colour in the movie. The final story is from the special, and it's Asajj Ventress in Sisters, and it's a 10-page story, and along with the 2 that were in the Heroes trade, completes the content that was in the special. Sisters focuses on Ventress right before she sets out to capture Ahsoka during Ahsoka's last arc in the Clone Wars. After seeing Ahsoka's bounty posted, she considers setting out to find her when she sees 2 young sisters attacked by a big guy trying to steal their food. Ventress chops his arms off, he runs away, and all is well. There's not really much to this story, to be honest, and most of it just exists so we can see Ventress reminiscing about the Night Mother and the Sisters of Dathomir. It seems kind of pointless because we only see her memories for 1 page, and even then the memories are nothing new, just a very quick recap of things that appeared in the show, so Ventress's story doesn't really do anything for me because nothing happens and there's nothing new, although you could argue that seeing this change and the way she went to help those sisters shows her turning over a new leaf and becoming something else after her dealings with Dooku, so there is that. It also shows what Ventress was doing moments before she finds Ahsoka on the run in the show, and it did show Ventress giving the sisters some kind words of guidance about looking after each other, but that's about it. Carlos Gomez did the pencils and Dono Sanchez Almara did the colours, and out of the 3 stories in the special, this is my favourite art. Plenty of action, cartoony but defined and sharp, good use of colours, everything I like in comic art is here. So adding this to the 2 special stories in the Heroes trade, it once again shows that 10-page stories might be fine for a very quick read, but it's just too short to really offer any depth or character growth, and just isn't very entertaining because of that. All 3 stories from the special combined make 30 pages, and I'd rather have seen just another normal length story like the rest of the Age comics about another character, rather than spending a third of the time on each one like this. Just like the Heroes trade, the back of the book contains all the variant art for the issues in this trade, and unlike in Heroes, none of them really stood out to me, except the Grievous cover by Pepe Larraz and Guru FX, but at least all the covers are included, so I can't knock it. It also has a preview section of the Heroes trade, which is weird because Heroes didn't have a preview section of villains, but maybe that's to balance out the page numbers since this has 1 less story from the special in it. I don't know, but that would be my guess. And just like the Heroes trade, after each story there's a page where each character gets a little bit of info divulged about them. Oh god, he's back. Don't make me say his name, I don't want to throw up again. The shilliest of shills does 1 or 2 of them. Fucking scumbag. I was talking to someone on Twitter about how involved George Lucas was with Clone Wars and who is responsible for bringing them all back, and he wanted to believe it was anyone except George Lucas because in his mind St. George could do no wrong. First off, special editions. Second off, prequels. Third off, Clone Wars cartoon. Look, I love George, and I think the original trilogy was excellent. I think the prequel trilogy was good. But let's not pretend the man doesn't make mistakes. He's only human. I told him it was George that wanted to bring Maul back, not Filoni. That George told him to bring Maul back. Filoni asked how, he's dead, and George said, I don't care, make it happen. And he didn't believe me. Lo and behold, printed in this very volume is proof of what I was talking about. I love being right all the time. I'm sure by now you've all seen my prediction from about 3 months before The Last Jedi came out about Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi and his new trilogy. Fucking right on the money with that I was. The point is, hypocrisy among the fans needs to stop. Stop criticising Disney for doing something, then saying Legends was great for doing the exact same thing. Generally, the Disney stuff is shit. I think I've made that pretty clear in my reviews. But let's not pretend George did everything perfectly either. Blasphemy? Not in my opinion. It's just being objective and realistic. Anyway, back to the book. Just like the Heroes trade, the Villains book is also quite floppy, and I like that for the exact same reason I did in Heroes. You can open the book properly without creasing the front cover or the spine and damaging the covers or the spine. So overall, Age of the Republic Villains is absolutely brilliant. It's the perfect companion for Age of the Republic Heroes, and I thought that was excellent. I preferred Villains to the Heroes version, and I think that was because there's just a bit more depth you can go into with the bad guys, whereas the good guys' stories tended to be quite simple and straightforward. I wasn't impressed with the special though. I feel like it was somewhat lacking because it tried to do too much without having enough time to do it, but the Darth Maul story was my absolute favourite and more than made up for it, and the way Hauser directly tied that to the Darth Maul trade was absolutely fantastic. Luke Ross's pencils throughout the whole volume were also flawless, and I really like his style where he shades with pencil on the face in quite a scratchy style, and since he also inked the comic, I'm doubly grateful for his work because he's allowed that scratchy shading to show through, which really gives the comic an old school hand-drawn kind of feel to it. And while I do like digital art in comics, my favourite era was the late 90s and early 2000s when the art was still hand-drawn and then it had colours either by hand or digital, and it had digital enhancements to like flares and stuff like that. And Ross's penciling and inking reminds me of just that, so I really like his work here. Not only that, but the way he draws his characters is spot on, and it's easy to see he's watched the movies, he knows and understands each individual character's movements and facial expressions. Thumbs up for Luke Ross. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of his work. Finally, Harvey Tartaglia's colours are great. They complement Ross's artwork nicely and nothing he did felt out of place, and every scene and every panel felt right, and he's allowed some of Ross's shading to show through, which doesn't happen in comics as often as it used to, and I really like the look, so he did a great job too. I'm really looking forward to reading more of Hauser's, Ross's and Tartaglia's work, and I really hope they work together as a team. I know they aren't doing the Age of the Rebellion series, which is something I'm really looking forward to after reading Age of the Republic, but I really hope Marvel use this team again because Age of the Republic Villains is by far one of the best Star Wars comics I've read in a long time, apart from Age of the Republic Heroes. I just hope we get a hardcover version that collects both Age, Heroes and Villains in one, similar to how we got Heroes for a New Hope. That would be the cherry on the cake for me. Oh yeah, with a dust jacket.